Hi, I'm Kostas.
Hi, I'm Lester.
Welcome to the first episode of What's with RWE podcast. The goal of this podcast is going to be to discuss how real-world data can make a meaningful impact on the lives of cancer patients. From time to time, we'll be featuring guests that play a role in cancer care and get their perspective on the use of real-world data.
Since this is probably our first podcast, Kostas, maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience.
So, tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Kostas Trakas. I'm currently the CEO for Exactis Innovation here in Montreal, Canada. Prior to that, I spent quite a bit of time in a large pharmaceutical organization, primarily looking at what was known at the time as health economics and outcomes research. Today, that's now known as real-world evidence generation. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Since those days, I went on to start up a couple of healthcare-related companies here in Canada, but now have the privilege of joining Exactis on its mission to really bring real-world data to the oncology space here in Canada. And Lester, how about you?
Yeah, my name is Lester Poon. The best way to describe it, I would say, is that I'm a real-world evidence data convert, because I have to say I was started as a skeptic here, right? So prior to my role as the Chief Business Development Officer here at Exactis Innovation, I was doing business development for a Canadian diagnostic startup. And this is where I actually first encountered even the concept of real-world data, real-world evidence. I was actually doing booth duty. So for those of you who've ever done booth duty, it's not necessarily the funnest thing to do. However, sometimes you get stuck doing it. At this conference that I was attending called ASCO, which is the American Society of Clinical Oncology, which is actually happening really soon. So I'm excited to go back here. I actually had quite a few attendees come up to me and ask me for access to real world data. And my follow-up question was always, since you already have clinical data or clinical trials data, to be more precise, like why do you even need real world data? Why do you even care about real world data? So maybe since our entire podcast here is really to educate everyone here that's watching this podcast about real world data. So maybe Kostas, you can help me out here. What is real world data to you?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. It's one that people struggle with sometimes because there's so much data now at our fingertips trying to make use of it and trying to make decisions of it. So let's start with what is real world data itself. So real world data essentially refers to any data that comes from outside of a clinical trial. So that can be day-to-day from a patient's charts, from their broader health records. It can be administrative data from a pharmacy or from an insurer. It can even be things as diverse as, the data coming off of a wearable like a Fitbit watch or something else that's used to track a patient's health and well-being. So it's a pretty broad definition in terms of what that data comes from. But really then real-world evidence is the evidence that is synthesized or is generated, the insights that are generated by using that strict clinically controlled data. And so it's really not meant to be a standalone in and of itself or a replacement, let's say, for clinical trial data. It's a different type of data. It's generally much more generalizable, and it stands as something that we can use that complements the type of data that you typically get from highly controlled clinical trials. So that's how I would sort of describe the data side as well as what it means from an evidence perspective.
Great, perfect. And just talking about having a Fitbit, I mean, I have a Garmin. I don't know if you have one of these things, Kostas. Do you use a wearable?
You know what? I recently converted to the Apple Watch, and I do kind of miss my Fitbit a little bit. But, I think everyone at some point is going to have these wearables in one way or another. And there's a lot of data that comes from them. Today, we don't really use a lot of it. It's really on the onus of the individual to try to make use of it. And I think we're going to be doing better in the future. But it's amazing how much data we as individuals and more importantly, as patients actually generate and that sort of sits unutilized. And I think that's the idea here is how do we use that data that tends to be generated anyways, generated in a lot of different places, siloed oftentimes from from the other, especially from the person who's helping you make clinical decisions. The question is, how do you utilize all of this data to really make the best decisions for you as a patient and for us more broadly as a healthcare community?
Yeah, no, just going to use cases. What we're talking about right now is really almost like potential uses for real world data. And, this is an area where I honestly don't have as much experience as yourself, Kostas. So it'd be great if you can run down a couple of them. But just on my daily life, I don't know if you did this with your Apple Watch or you're currently doing with your Apple Watch, but for my Garmin, it tracks like everything. Maybe the data isn't 100% accurate. However, it gives a very nice trend. If I look at maybe a single day, maybe not be great, but if I look at over a couple of days and nights and I know, hey, you know what, I'm really not getting that great amount of sleep.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny you mentioned sleep. Sleep is, I think, one of the best applications. But I think more generally, when I think about what real world data does and how to utilize it, it does two things for you. I think that nothing else can really do really effectively. The first is to establish your baseline, right? So how are things going right now? If you do nothing else, there's no intervention, what does that look like? So by comparison, if you are looking at making a policy decision, do we change the way we screen patients, for example, for cancer? Do we reimburse a new product coming to the market? You first have to understand, what does it look like today? Where are the gaps or the unmet needs? And I think that's the first thing that real world data does. And it's no different than saying, how am I sleeping today? You have to have a starting point to make a decision from. So that's the first sort of major use case, is establishing that pattern of today. Then the second part is, what happens if I change something, if I intervene in your case, in my bedtime routine, or how much coffee I drink during the day or whatever. Same thing goes for the introduction of a new option for screening or treatment. You have to then be able to track, after the introduction of this change, what's that done to your population. And for sure, people will argue the data from a controlled clinical trial should tell you that. The only real difference is, the way that, coffee affects me potentially is going to be different than the way it affects you. So that goes to the question of generalizability. If you do a trial that with people that are sort of kind of like me, and, I can drink coffee till, anytime in the evening, I'm going to tell you this, I'll fall asleep like a bump on a log. It's not going to be a problem. But if that's all you have, you don't actually have the understanding of how that's going to impact everyone else. And real world data does exactly that. It gives you that broader perspective across the population, across kinds of patients that don't always make it into your clinical trial programs, the traditional clinical trial programs. So that's why I started off saying that this is not a replacement for clinical trial data. This is really complementary, and it gives you a different perspective. So those are two, I think, of the most important use cases. The third one that I think is one that is only starting to come to light now is, can you make decisions early on and then utilize that data to confirm whether you were right or wrong? So, for example, reimbursing a new product or letting a new product on the market. Can you make a decision early on and then continue collecting data and seeing whether or not it was the right decision, both from a cost standpoint as well as from the outcome standpoint, and safety, of course, always as well. So these are I think the big areas of real world evidence. There are obviously so many very micro use cases, but these I'd say are the really big ones for me.
It's actually really, really educational. And I'm just thinking, right now we probably have billions of people watching this podcast right now. So let me just assume that not everyone understands exactly sort of nuances between clinical trials and real world data. So maybe going back to your second point, let's pull on that thread a little bit. Why are clinical trials not representative of what happens in the real world?
So the best way to think about it is, you're trying to compare an intervention. So let's use drugs. They're the most common one that we, I think, would all be thinking about. So let's say you're trying to compare a drug and you want to see whether or not it improves the outcomes in a particular patient population. if you include all different types of people, different ages, with different complexities of disease, different comorbidities. So someone who has, let's say, an issue with their kidneys versus someone who has congestive heart failure versus someone who is completely healthy, all three of those individuals would potentially respond very differently. And what you end up with then is this scatter of information that is potentially driven not by the treatment that you are testing, but by a number of other variables. The ones I mentioned are ones that are easily seen, it's the health status of the individual, but there's a multitude of other potential measures that you don't necessarily see and you can't necessarily measure, or you don't think ahead are important enough to measure. And what you end up with is this spread of results that result in potentially saying this product may not be very helpful because you have the result in very different groups of individuals. So what a clinical trial does is, first of all, it ensures that the type of patient you're testing is very specific. What that does is it gets rid of a lot of this noise that would otherwise influence the outcome, whether or not you can even tell if the drug is effective or not, right? So that's the fundamental reason for having very homogeneous, very similarly looking individuals in a clinical trial program, because you're trying to get rid of as much of the noise and just focus on, is the drug really doing what it's meant to do? And is it doing it in a way that it's safe? Beyond that, there are the question of, can this be replicated in all these other populations that I mentioned? Those are follow-on trials. That's where real-world evidence comes in. And it's really there to ensure that you can actually see the efficacy, if efficacy is actually there.
Great. Yeah, so for me, just not being a part of this field, the way that I guess I think about it after you kind of went over the details, which is great, is I think about it almost as, from the terms of, let's say you're playing a game, some sort of, let's say, basketball game. Since actually right now it's the NBA playoffs plus the NHL playoffs are happening right now at the same time, right? So in the NHL game or hockey game, everyone is playing by a set of rules, right? A very, very standard set of rules. And there's a referee on the field. And on top of it, it's in a very controlled environment, right? It's an arena that is a certain size. The nets are a certain size from each other. And then the pads that the goalies wear are a certain size, right? Everything is confined from that perspective, or not confined, but it is controlled from that perspective. So when two teams play each other, now you can duke it out and see who wins. It's like, it's because they're based on their talent or their effort, right? That's what you're in some ways trying to measure. Whereas let's say now you play the same game, but in, I don't know, the streets of Toronto or the streets of Vancouver. Now there's going to be potholes here, potholes there. The nets are going to be necessarily the right size, right? Someone might have the sticks aren't going to be all the same, right? Someone may have a little bit bigger pads than the other person. So these things are uncontrolled. So one could say that, in this uncontrolled environment, you don't necessarily truly gauge just pure talent. Maybe it's people that play hockey better without skates, right? People that are able to withstand the weather conditions as well. So it doesn't control for all those things. So that's the way I guess I think about it, is sometimes the real world, just stuff happens, right? Stuff happens that's unforeseen, and unfortunately you have to deal with that. And that's what clinical trials, I guess, do not capture.
Thank you for coming to Lester's TED Talk.
I love that analogy. It really is exactly that. It is trying to control as much of the factors that could change the outcome and keeping that consistent across all of the people that you're looking at, so that it really comes down to, in the case of the game, who's the most talented team versus is it the conditions or some advantage that somebody has versus another that would be outcome. So I love that. It's a terrific way to sort of describe clinical trials versus a real world.
Since we were talking about this pivoting, a side thought that I had was, do you remember not recently, because we actually were attending a conference called ISPOR, right?
Yep.
Which is, now I'm going to butcher the acronym. I think it's called the International Society of Pharmacoepidemiology and I think Outcomes Research. And it was in Boston this year.
Yes. Yep.
Right. And what reminded me of that was that, well, besides the fact that we just recently attended it, however, it was the Boston Marathon kind of showcased exactly what we were talking about beforehand, right? A couple of years back, I forgot if it was 2018 or 2019, a Japanese runner won the marathon, right? The Boston Marathon, which is highly rare. It tends to be someone from Ethiopia, or wherever it may be. It tends not to be from Japan, right? At least not for the men's side. But that year, Boston had very odd weather, right? It was very, very rainy and it was very, very cold. So all the runners from, I think, Ethiopia and from like other countries that were hotter, they just couldn't, they couldn't, it just didn't work. They went out there, they got cramps, and they couldn't like finish the course. Whereas this Japanese runner who's more used to the cold was able to just tough it out and was able to win the Boston Marathon. I forgot if it was 2018 or 2019, a couple years back. And so it almost like shows a little bit about when things aren't in a controlled environment, how, unforeseen circumstances can kind of arise from that. But, on that note, from attending Boston, so it's kind of our little transitioned over to ISPOR, which also happened in Boston. This was my first time attending ISPOR. It was obviously not your first time attending ISPOR, Kostas. I think you were membership number, what was it again?
1,982. It's an OG membership number right there. They've become tremendously successful. The amount of focus on health economics, on outcomes research, or real world evidence has really skyrocketed. So I think the last membership number I had to get was over 300,000. So just goes to show that in the 10 years since I sort of last attended, and really the focus has really shifted, I think, for a lot of decision makers to ensure that they are thinking about the economic case for adoption of new technologies, the patient's perspective, which is part of, I think, a lot of these decisions now, and most importantly for us in our discussion, the type of data and really broadening the type of data to be used for making these kinds of decisions. So the number of people attending now just, I think, reflects what the interest is and how decisions are being made.
Yeah, I have to admit, I didn't know so many people care about real world data and real world evidence until I joined ISPOR, until I was attending this meeting. So this is my first time attending ISPOR, but maybe you could give you a little bit of your experience first, Kostas, on the time you first attended ISPOR to today. Did you see any differences from the topics that came up or what people presented, just the conference overall?
There's a couple of things. When I look at the macro trends, when I first started going, the use of health economics for making reimbursement decisions was still new, right? So it was a conference talking about the methodologies, talking about the decision-making frameworks, even the tools that could potentially be used for making these decisions. So it was really focused on this new approach to making decisions for especially pharmacotherapies. Diagnostics have come into the mix since then, but it was focused on that. And I kind of had the same feeling with real world evidence, because a lot of the talks, touched on how do you use real world evidence, for example, for supporting regulatory decisions. We know that both the EMEA in Europe as well as the FDA in the US have adopted recommendations to start utilizing it as part of the marketing authorization frameworks, right? So now the question that comes up is, well, how do you determine quality? How do you ensure that the analyses are run in a way that there's transparency, that it's the privacy of patients is taken into account, that it's high quality enough that it can be utilized for making these kinds of legal and regulatory decisions, not to mention for reimbursement, right? So all of this is what I saw sort of in all of the presentations and the podium discussions from a standpoint of how do we build the rules and the frameworks for this. The other thing that I saw, and it reflects, I think, more generally in the time that we're in, is the use of technology, specifically machine learning, AI more generally, to start to take all this data and very rapidly be able to utilize it to generate insights. Right. So I think for me, the big takeaways, I mean, there's all the other work that in health economics that still needs to be done, and a lot of questions and methodological issues were still there. Predominantly for me, those were the big things that I pulled. It's the sort of new guidances around how to use these tools for RWE for new decision-making applications, but also new tools that everybody is using everywhere else, and how do we use it in the world of data and in the world of using that data to make decisions.
Yeah, and for me, this was my first time attending ISPOR, and actually being in Boston. But maybe that's a story for another time. Being the first time in Boston, but it was for me, it was a fantastic meeting, primarily because it's just like-minded people, tons of like-minded people. It was a little bit, I have to admit, preaching to the choir a little bit. There was not as obviously everyone there is on board with real world data, on board with real world evidence. So it was great to see that. For me, the use cases that you talked about, those 3 use cases around landscape for submissions, optimization. What's the third one? Oh, following the actual recommendations and then subsequently seeing if they play out, right? These different use cases seem to be actually somewhat, I wouldn't say 100% mature, but very close to that people seem to be all in agreement that these were important use cases. I guess for me, what was a little bit disappointing, I would say, was that I didn't see anything that was super outside of these cases. There wasn't something so creative that I thought, wow, that's a really interesting look at real world data, real world evidence. That's something that we haven't thought about. But that's partially because maybe a little biased in that we were unfortunately not able to attend all the meetings or all the different sessions and all the different poster sessions. There's so much great content out there that we just couldn't go through all of them. So, apologies if someone at ISPOR has a novel use case for real world data, real evidence. Feel free to send us an email and let us know. Apologies. We'll make that correction on our next podcast, right? But yeah, that was the one thing that I would admit I was a little bit personally disappointed, was I didn't see anything that I thought was super, super novel. But on the flip side, what did surprise me was maybe not the use case of real world data that was novel, but the types of real world data that people are capturing are moving beyond the medical charts that we're all very familiar with. They're moving towards patient-reported outcomes, which actually here's maybe where you can define that for the audience as well.
Patient-reported outcomes was really meant to be a very large catch-all beyond just the traditional quality of life. I think we all have a good sense for what that entails, but it's meant to be broad enough to look at not just the quality of your life, but things like, can you do what you really want? Your activities of daily living, for example, which are not really based on symptoms. It's, can I get up? Can I walk as far as I want? It's meant to reorient and look at illnesses from the perspective of what's important to a patient. So symptoms certainly are pretty heavily represented. And in some cases, the patient-reported outcome is actually the major outcome for a trial. Think of pain medication, for example. It's really the patient reporting on how much pain they feel, right? So in that case, that becomes the primary endpoint for that clinical trial. But it's a very broad category, and it's really meant to capture the patient's perspective on their state of health.
Yeah, and one of our board members is Barry Stein from Colorectal Cancer Canada. So that was probably music to his ears that people are really trying to capture the patient's voice, right?
Yeah. No, I think you make a good point of the expansion beyond the traditional sources of data. And as I mentioned off the top, there are a lot of different ways for capturing that, and I think both sort of the revolution in terms of interacting with others through mobile services, certainly, being able to actually capture people's input, irrespective of where they are, home, in a clinic, on the go. Those kinds of things have certainly unlocked the potential of being able to capture this data. So I think a lot of what you see, and maybe the lack of that, moonshot type or incredibly surprising and revolutionary use of RWE data, is really about where we are technologically. We have just kind of got to the point where we can start pulling information from multiple sources, and we're just getting to the point where we're starting to get comfortable, may not be the right word, but where there is at least, being in Boston and being with companies that are predominantly working with US data sets, where there is more comfort, let's say, in connecting data sets. And I think that connectivity between different types of data is where the benefit will really come from, because then you get the full tapestry of a patient and their journey and the impact of a disease on that patient and the impact of potential treatments potentially for that patient. So I think that technology is starting to get us to the point where we now can start think about what do we do with all this data. I think that's one of the things that here in Canada, we are maybe quite a ways behind in terms of our comfort level in connecting those data together, and even in allowing that data to be shared. I think one of the conversations I had was with an organization that really goes at it from the patient side, saying, this is your data. Do you want to share it? And actually helps them do that in a way that not only helps research, but also allows them to sort of be able to have this structured data that they're able to then use for their own decision-making purposes. And I think those kinds of concepts are a little bit far off from the Canadian healthcare landscape and potentially from the comfort level of most Canadian patients. So it's interesting. We're two markets that are sitting right next door to each other, but at very different levels or very different states in terms of real world data, how it's used, and what we're comfortable with.
Yeah, actually, that was one thing that was quite surprising for me at the conference, is that there was a huge Canadian presence, right? There was even one of the booths was a group from Canada, and they had a beaver as the as on their booth, right? Which was, some people actually mistakenly thought it was a rat. So I guess they're from the same family or same genus. So I guess that makes sense. But specifically on the Canadian side, yeah, we had quite a few conversations with Canadian folks. But actually, before I we jump into that, I just want to give a little credit over to Dr. Christy Ziegler over at Duke University, who helped us better understand the patient-reported outcome side of things. So that was awesome. Thank you a lot, Christy, for actually having that conversation with us. And of course, we had great conversations, a lot of Canadians over at ISPOR, which I guess kind of makes sense. We're not that far away from Boston.
I'm not surprised that the number of Canadians there. I think that meeting itself has always been a good draw. I think it also reflects the fact that from the standpoint of health technology assessment, Canada has always been in the forefront in terms of adopting frameworks to make the best decisions, not only for patients, but also for taxpayers, right? Because we have to remember we're a taxpayer-funded medical system, and we have to really be smart about how we're using that funding. And these processes are supposed to sort of take away the emotion, let's say, and put a sort of a decision framework in place that uses the best data available. So I'm not surprised they were there. I was pleasantly happy to see the focus on using more than just the typical clinical trial data, the amount of effort being made and to start incorporating all this different sources of data into not only how they make decisions internally, how they look at new treatments potentially, where their place in therapy is going to be, but also in their submissions going to both Health Canada as well as to CADTH for that initial health technology assessment. So, it was good to see. Not surprising, we've been leaders in this particular space, and it's nice to see we're continuing on that front.
No, that absolutely great to see tons of Canadians there. I know we don't have too much time left. I know our producers here are kind of make us wrap up soon. But the thing that I did want to maybe touch on, because we did have a lot of conversations with Canadians about what is the exact term? I think it's called CADTH's time limited recommendations. I think that was the kind of a point of conversation that we had with quite a few folks. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that before we wrap up our first podcast here, Kostas. So maybe you can set the scene. What is time limited recommendations? Or who's CADTH first? Maybe actually, who is CADTH first? Let's start there. Who is CADTH first?
So CADTH is oh my gosh, and you're going to put me on the spot here to try and remember their acronym. It's been so the Canadian Association for Drug and Therapeutic Health Technology Assessment is something like that, and we may have to edit that in post production just to make sure we get it right. But so essentially, they are the ones that take the first step in trying to determine what is the value. Is there value for money in terms of adopting a new technology? And it's very broad. We're talking about new surgical techniques. It can be new diagnostics, but most often they're really looking at new therapies, new drug therapies that are coming to market. Their bread and butter is doing, you have a group of clinicians really doing that clinical review, trying to ensure that the clinical data that the decisions are based on makes sense, that it's of good quality. From there, actually trying to see what the cost of those outcomes are and whether or not that balances out from a cost effectiveness standpoint. So that's CADTH. This is not something that they do on their own. It does require the manufacturers to make a submission with the best evidence that they believe is available. And then it's a sort of a question and answer sort of opportunity to review the information, go look for additional information, ask questions of the manufacturer, and in the end, make a recommendation to each of the provinces whether or not they believe that there is a value in adopting this new technology. So that's CADTH, which is the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, as I've been corrected now. So that's CADTH. They are starting to look at different approaches to making recommendations, because the traditional approach is it's a yes or no, or a recommendation or no recommendation. And oftentimes, especially for drugs in oncology, where you're getting products early coming to the market earlier, so with phase 2 data only. So in other words, they haven't got their final controlled clinical studies, but there's enough evidence in hand to show that there is efficacy, especially for populations with high need. In other words, there are no other options. And so without this product, there's the likelihood that there is nothing else you could do for this patient. So, for those types of scenarios, you get a recommendation happening much earlier. If the data is really not that great at that point, you don't have a lot of patient experience, you don't really have a good understanding of side effects, especially the long-term side effects, you don't have the long-term outcomes, then there's a lot of uncertainty. Are you making the right recommendation? Are you making the right decision? So this concept of whether it's time limited reimbursement or contingent reimbursement, there's a lot of different terms for it, but essentially what you're saying is, look, we're going to approve this product. We're going to make a recommendation to approve this product or to reimburse it. But what we want to do is to only fix that for, let's say, 2 years or 3 years, whatever the duration is going to be. And during that time, additional data needs to be generated. Additional evidence needs to be generated so that we can be certain that the decision we've made is actually the right one. So in that period of time, you're not taking away an opportunity from a patient that may make sense, that may give them the best outcome possible for them. But you're also continuing to collect information so that at some point you can validate that, yep, this was the right decision. It's a good value for money. We made the right decision at the get-go. But it also gives you the opportunity to say, maybe it's not the right decision, and for that reason, we're not going to continue to reimburse it. So that's, in a nutshell, that's the time limit reimbursement discussion that CADTH is conducting right now, and actually looking for feedback on that.
So perfect. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for for producer Sam for the quick typing of the actual name CADTH. I'm sure. Actually, you were pretty close, You were pretty close, Kostas. You actually memorized that pretty good. So, kudos to you for that. But maybe we should unpack that just a little bit here because you went through quite a lot and really great information. But maybe for folks, if I could first talk about moving from clinical trials, phase 2 and phase 3. So for folks that aren't as familiar with these terms or this type of process for drug development, again, Kostas talked about clinical trials, which is a very controlled environment to be able to compare your drug versus or some sort of treatment versus what is being currently done as a quote unquote standard. So the comparator. And then on the flip side of that, you have phase 2 and phase 3. So by and large, my understanding, Kostas, and you can correct me here because I'm probably going to be slightly wrong here, is phase 2s tends to be just slightly smaller. You're testing a smaller population, whereas phase 3 is slightly larger population with maybe a little bit longer, not a little bit, but a bit longer follow-up time as well, so that you can actually get the gold standard endpoint, which is overall, unfortunately, it's overall survival. So how long did you increase overall survival? Whereas in a phase 2, you may use a so-called surrogate endpoint, or an endpoint that isn't necessarily the gold standard, but something that is representative of the gold standard, like PFS or progression-free survival. Did they get that roughly correct, Kostas?
Yeah, I think you've got it pretty close. I think the one thing I'll add to it is that phase 2 typically is smaller. And when you have fewer patients, the chances, and it all has to do with statistics really at this point, the chance of actually seeing something that's there is greatly reduced. So specifically, if you believe that this product delivers a better outcome, so more patients survive or they survive longer without the disease reoccurring, when you have fewer patients, it's always a comparison, right? Or typically, it's a comparison to something else, to a control arm, to what we do today, for example. The chance of seeing that difference and being able to say, yep, it's a real difference and we should believe it, is smaller when you have fewer patients. So that's really the biggest difference between phase 2 and phase 3. Once you get to phase 3, you typically will calculate how many patients would I need if this benefit really was there. How many patients do I need to be pretty sure that it's real? That if I see a difference, it's a real difference, and I should believe it. So that's one of the biggest differences between phase 2 and phase 3. So that's why phase 3s are often called the confirmatory trial, because they confirm something that you might have already seen, because typically those phase 3 trials are really expensive. They take a very long time to actually conduct. And the goal is really to try to get a sense up front in a phase 2 whether or not you think you're going to see that. Because you typically are not just going to go to a phase 3 if you don't have confidence that you're going to be able to replicate what you saw in the phase 2 study. So, if you see something, you got to confirm it at some point with a larger group of patients. That's one of the big differences between those two.
Got it. That's really, really helpful. And, since we're, keeping with the theme of the overall podcast, so what's with the time-limited recommendations? Like what was everyone talking about? What was people's perspectives on it? From my perspective, what I saw was that most people had seemed to have an issue with certain components of it. And I didn't fully understand that, but maybe we can talk a little bit about that here, Kostas, in the last maybe 5 minutes, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah. So, in the informal conversations that we had, really I think everyone is pleased that CADTH is looking at this as a new way of approaching making recommendations. And the reason for that is, the number one complaint that you typically get is until the full process and the full phase 3 data package have been produced and the, phase 3 confirms what you see in phase 2. In the past, that meant patients would have to wait that entire period. They'd have to go through the regulatory process with that full entire package. And then at some point, it's going to become available for patients. So that's a long delay for some patients who really have no other options. And I think where it becomes an issue is the fact that in the US, that process tends to occur 1 to even 2 years sooner than it does here in Canada. So if you're looking, comparatively across the border, there has always been this concern that patients are not getting access to medications that are potentially life-saving at the same rate as those in other markets like the US, like the UK or Germany. So that was, I think, by far, everyone is pleased to see something that can actually accelerate that process here in Canada. I think where the question came up, and really focusing on RWE, the question comes up, is the only source of data for confirmation that this product really is doing what it says, is it only a phase 3 study? And at this point in time, the recommendation by CADTH is that, yes, we will give you potentially a time-limited reimbursement, but only until you have your phase 3 clinical trials. And I think the question from a lot of people is, especially where there's a more rare population, so fewer patients available, where the time that it takes and the cost that it takes to actually generate that evidence is going to be much lower and at a much greater expense. Can't real world evidence, the real sort of use of the product in the real population, can that not potentially also be used in place potentially for that confirmation of the value of the product, of the cost effectiveness of the product in the real world, in the setting that it's going to be approved for? So that's the big, I think, disconnect from some folks. Everybody loves the idea, but the devil is always in the details. And the thing missing in these details is, where does RWE fit in the decision-making process?
Yeah, to play to play a little bit of devil's advocate, since we're on this train of thought, is could one say CADTH is making this recommendation or this potential framework for a time-limited recommendation, and they say that you need to get to phase 3 data because that is the goal. That has been the goal that has been set traditionally for all for how many decades it has, to relieve pharmaceutical companies or others to have to do these phase 3 clinical trials is almost like make it easier for them, right? Where CADTH and maybe others could say that CADTH is just trying to do the best for Canadian cancer patients, make sure that whatever is approved has the strong enough data to demonstrate that it's truly effective. Just because our neighbors down south go riding on a motorcycle doing a handstand doesn't mean we should do that as well, right? Maybe that's CADTH's case. So could one say that, or would you say that maybe there's some nuances here that we have to kind of better understand?
Yeah, I definitely think there's some nuances for us to unpack. So for sure, the best way to confirm what you see in phase 2 is with a phase 3. That's unequivocal, I think, just from a statistical standpoint. I'm never going to stand up, down from that. But the real question is, do we have the data framework in Canada to be able to use RWE, as we would like to, in order to make these decisions in place of a phase 3. So if you have a large enough population and you have enough data on these patients, you can actually control for a lot of the variability. Not everything. So it's granted. I know there'll be people potentially in the comments at some point that will say, no, you're incorrect. It's not the same thing. And I'm not saying that it is, but is it close enough? Is it something that potentially can make to make it a lot more feasible to have products developed in smaller populations, especially, and as the focus now going to small biomarker populations or rare populations that are defined by a couple of different criteria. Those are very challenging to bring through that full, typical, robust clinical trial model. But the question here is, with siloed data sets, with provinces really separating data, just really in their own silo. Do we have the capabilities in Canada yet to be able to do complete analysis on new products coming to market and, with any confidence say, yeah, we're confident that this really is able to replace a phase 3 clinical trial. And I think that for me is the big question mark. For us at Exactis, it's one of the things we're trying to address, is trying to ensure that we have the right data sets, broad enough, pan-Canadian, so that you're making a decision. It's really reflective of the entire diversity within the Canadian population. But I don't know that we really have, that anyone has really gotten to the point yet where they can say we're comfortable with the data that we have, the access to the data, and the quantity or the quality of the data that we're willing to replace phase 3s with RWE. So that, for me, that's the big question mark.
Yeah, I think that's another conversation that for another time, quality, because I think that may be something we should talk about next time for our next podcast, is around quality of RWE or data in general, because we're probably going to maybe get a special guest on next time, and that'll be actually pretty good for that conversation. But, to give a little credit to, not a little, but a lot of credit to CADTH, great job in terms of actually releasing something like this and trying to get comments from everyone in the overall ecosystem. And on top of it, additional a little bit more credit to them as well. They did say RWE as supplemental or complementary data that could potentially be submitted as well. So they already seems like thinking along those lines of potentially incorporating RWE into the overall process, overall framework. So definitely kudos to them for that and opening up for discussion. So I think what you're suggesting, Kostas, if I could maybe reframe it a little bit, is not to say that phase 3s aren't necessary, but perhaps there's a pragmatic way to use real world evidence inside the process. Maybe it's something as simple as, if you have good enough RWE, maybe that allows you to extend the time when you actually have to produce a phase 3, right? I think right now in the recommendation is 3 years. Maybe you bump it to like 4 years, 5 years, whatever it may be, right? Just to give everyone a little bit more time to one, patients can get access to the producer of the actual therapy, has a little bit more time to accumulate that data if the RWE data looks satisfactory to it for a certain perspective.
Yeah, I think that this is an evolving landscape. I think CADTH is, has kudos to them for taking it on. They've already started looking at how to define quality real world evidence. So they're trying to take a very methodical approach to it. No one wants to jump in and completely change our decision-making model, off the bat, because it's what everyone else is doing. But certainly, the FDA, the EMEA, Australia has recently adopted, the framework as well. So others are starting to get to the point where they're comfortable and starting to utilize the data that is available to them. So it's a line that has to be crossed at some point. The question is going to be, when is that going to occur? At what point do we really open it up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we got to wrap things up. We're running really, really late now for our producers here. So we want to be gentle on our producers, make sure that our first podcast is, in a good time frame. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. Thanks a lot, Kostas, for the conversation. It's been great. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the first episode of What's with RWE. And I hope you will have a great day. And of course, listen and tune in next time for our second podcast.
Thanks, Lester. Thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.